Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Mark Walmsley, and I'm the founder of the Arts and Culture Network. We're a growing global community of over 185,000 now across our 8 arts and culture LinkedIn groups. But as I often say, I don't get to meet everyone, but when I do, it's a pleasure. And Brian Holihan has joined me today. Brian is one of our new full members, for which many thanks, because we're entirely member funded as an independent community. Brian, thank you so much for joining me to do this today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. We're going to have some fun today. I'm going to create your fantasy cultural year, and I have a magic wand and a time machine at my disposal. There are no wrong answers, you'll be pleased to know, and it always brings out surprises, anecdotes, and conversational detours. But before I do that, I wonder if you could take a moment just to say hi to everyone. Tell us about the work that you're doing and your interests and passions. I'm particularly keen to hear about your desire to bring more humanities experts into the development of AI, and I'm keen to hear about the work that you do for on people's resumes and CVs and LinkedIn profiles. So over to you, Brian.
Yeah,
Well,
sure. I have my work is in two different streams that converge. Ever since I was a boy, I was just fascinated by a diversity of different cultures and how different cultures form their views of reality. So, I've done as much reading as I could about that and as much traveling as I could. The I had a trip around the world back in 2007, and I was being iconoclastic. I was going to places that aren't so commonly studied, not the better known civilizations in Europe or China or India, but I went through part of Southeast Asia, a little bit of East Africa, and part of the Middle East. And I mean, these cultures are obviously just as rich, but they were all so different from each other. And seeing them back to back to back was, at that point, the most inspiring experience I've ever had. Because every time I went to a new culture and new country, I had all the other ones in my rearview mirror. And ultimately, everything, it just seemed to be in this field of light and love where everything just reflected each other. And so I wrote two books about that, how to have that kind of experience. My next trip was a 3-month trip through Greece and Italy. And that was the first time that I had seen ancient West, Italian Renaissance and all that. And seeing them after going to these non-Western cultures, I saw these other cultures reflected, like when I saw the Parthenon. And that was equally inspiring, because it was always just seeing everything from bigger perspectives, in light of multiple cultures. The other thing that I do is writing resumes. And I have 98 reviews on Google, and every one is 5-star. And the reason is because I take extra time with clients and I analyze their backgrounds, their accomplishments more in depth. And so, I'll be very happy to be a resource for people in this network. Having loved arts and culture all my life, I can articulate the value of that as well as dig into people's accomplishments. So I write about these larger cultural landscapes and people as well. And I like to go back and forth. It's always thinking outside the box, seeing things from more perspectives.
well, that's great. And I've just pulled up the books on Amazon. So let me just see if I can share this. Have I found the right books here? Thinking in a New Light.
Yeah,
Yep. And Teaching the Mind to Dance.
yeah, those are the troublemakers. They'll get people to
Excellent.
think about things in new and unconventional ways.
Well, I love it. So if you're watching this, then links to those books and others that are available will be on this page. Now, I'm torn now. I don't know whether to build your fantasy cultural year around studying different cultures and writing about them, which is your passion, or your desire to bring more humanities expertise into the development of AI. I'll let you choose. Would you like to go on a year's travel writing about different cultures sponsored by a wealthy family foundation? Or would you rather go and meet AI technologists around the world to try and influence the development of AI into a more humanitarian direction? Which of those two fantasy cultural years would you enjoy?
I'd enjoy both, but I've done the former already. The latter has a lot more, I think, use for people.
Excellent. Now, I don't know the names
So
of
the
the
latter.
key people. Let's do the latter. I don't know the names of the key people, but this is only a mechanism for getting you to travel around the world, really. So, um, okay, so I'm going to have to place you somewhere in the world. And to do that, I'd like to ask you, what's your favorite building?
Um, One of them is Preco, and it's in Cambodia, and it was one of the first two large temples built in the Angkor area, and it influenced. I mean, Angkor Wat, of course, is one of my favorites as well. But a great thing about Preco is it was written 200. I'm sorry, it was built about 250 years before, and it impressed me because there's nothing formative about it. It's refined from ground to crown. Carvings on it, and it's the, it has these symmetrical walls around the central area where there are six little temples, and it could see influences from older civilizations, a couple of older civilizations on the Mekong, the Chenla and the Funan. Could also see civilizations from the Cham cultures in central and southern Vietnam, of course, India, and
Let's have a quick
possibly
look.
Java.
Yeah, I'm going to show everybody just in case they're not familiar with it. But these are the walls you were. So this is Preco, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah, wonderful
Yes.
looking place, isn't it? Now, I'd like you to imagine, for the purposes of this interview and your fantasy cultural year, that there is a pop-up bar here, okay, right next to Preco. And you're sitting there enjoying the view. It's 6 p.m. on a sunny June evening, and there's a drink on the table next to you. What drink would we find there?
Ginger tea, I think.
Oh, yes, ginger tea. And there is a book next to you on the table that you've been rereading or reading. Um, it's a book that it's a favorite book, or it's a recent discovery, or it's a book that's changed your life, perhaps. What book would we find next to you?
I would say mimesis, the representation of reality in the West, by Eric Arbach. I read that back when I was in my 20s, and he um, he wrote about all of these different Western writers from Homer and from Genesis to up to Virginia Woolf, and he wrote it in the 40s. So Virginia Woolf kind of represented what was modern at that time, and what really impressed me about it was how he interwove historical events, aspects of of language that they were writing in, the author's experiences. It showed me how a work of art is very multidimensional in terms of its influences. And
Fantastic. What was the name of the author again?
Eric, Erich, Auerbach.
Got him. There he is. Um, yeah. So he looks an awful lot like Benjamin Britten, doesn't he? Um,
Yeah.
Excellent. And what was the name of the book
So
again?
mimesis, Mimesis.
Got it.
It's an ancient Greek word for imitation.
Yeah, the representation of reality in Western literature.
Yeah.
Fantastic. More than half a century after its translation into English, Eric Arbach's Bach's Mimesis remains a masterpiece of literary criticism. Fantastic. Yeah, it's
It's a little
available
bit
on,
heavy
yeah, it's on Amazon
to
should anyone want to grab that.
for
Um,
people with limited time. I mean, the first chapter, comparing Homer and Genesis, and the chapter on Dante are really stellar.
Fantastic. I've never read it, so that's I love doing these interviews because I get educated, which is really good. That's great. Now you're sitting there in front of Preco with the ginger tea and the Mimesis book, and you're listening to some music on some headphones. What would be playing while you're sitting there?
That's a tough one, Mark, because I like a lot of different styles of music. If I had to choose one, it would be big band. Maybe Benny
Nice.
Goodman's first concert at Carnegie Hall in 1937.
Whose concert?
Benny Goodman,
Oh, yeah.
or something by Duke Ellington or Tommy Dorsey, the greatest
Yeah.
hits or something like that. Um,
Fantastic choice. I saw Buddy Rich and his band at
uh,
Ronnie Scott's in 1972,
yeah.
which was just wonderful. I was 9 years old, so and I got to meet him in the dressing room, which was great. And he gave me some of his sticks, so I loved that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I
He
loved
was
it.
he had a pretty mercurial personality, not always pleasant. So
No, exactly. I've heard some of those recordings of the arguments on the tour bus. Yeah, excellent. Okay, now. So you're feeling quite pleased with yourself because you've just heard that you've been approached by um, a wealthy family foundation that has heard about your commitment to humanities and AI. Okay, they would like to hire you for a year. The fee is enormous. The travel is first class, as is the accommodation. They would like you to travel the world to interview leading technologists in AI to because they'd like to support your mission that we need to make the future of AI much more humanitarian. Okay, there is a book deal in it. A TV crew will follow you for the year as you interview these leaders. There is a TED Talk when you get back, if you want. And then there's a global university lecture tour. You become the go-to commentator on making AI more humanitarianly oriented. Does that sound like fun?
all right. Oh, sorry. What was your
Does
question?
that sound like a fun year?
Yeah, very much so.
Fantastic. Okay, so where are we going first? I have a magic wand and a time machine for this interview. So where would you like to start? And are there any particular AI leaders who you'd like to interview?
Yeah, one would be Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic. He's expressed concern about uses of AI.
Okay, where would he be based?
He's right in my neck of the woods. I mean, right in Silicon Valley.
Fantastic. Okay, so
I,
we're
I
gonna,
think sorry, I think San Francisco. I think
okay, San Francisco. So we'll fly you up to San Francisco, okay, in a private jet, probably, because the Wealthy Family Foundation are paying for this. They want this. Now you get on the plane, and the steward brings you a ginger tea and a message and a challenge from the Family Foundation. They would like you to limit your musical listening to one very specific genre of music for 12 months to the exclusion of all else. I know you're a big band fan, but is there anything that you would want to listen to exclusively for 12 months?
say big band. Again, that's tough, Mark, because
It is tough.
I like
I couldn't choose. I've got very broad taste in music, but so big band it is. That's great. Now, you arrive in San Francisco, and a group of young technologists have been detailed to take you under their wing. They whisk you to a lovely beachfront apartment in San Francisco, which you're renting for while you do your interview. And they've helped you unpack. They said, relax, make yourself at home. We're going to come back and take you to a dance performance and then out to dinner. Okay. Now, this is where the magic wand comes in because I can put any dance-based performance on the stage in front of you. It can be any style, any group, any dancers, living or not. What dance performance can I put on that stage for you, Brian?
Say Bharatanatyam, classical Indian dance. I lived in India back in 1996, and the travels that I did in Southeast Asia were, I often, had India in mind, and just love the creativity in Southeast Asia, how they took influences from India and made them their own. Um, Bharatanatyam, there are these ideas, texts like the Shilpa Shastra, Shilpashastra, that talk about these dance forms um, basically embody, energies from the creation of the universe. They're supposed to transport the audience into just a higher awareness of how things are related to each other and basically
Love that.
sacred.
I love that. That's a great choice. And what about dinner afterwards? San Francisco has restaurants offering all sorts of cuisine. So, what would be your cuisine of choice? You can choose anything.
I would say Burmese, Myanmar.
Burmese or Myanmar. That's a wonderful combination of, that's an evening. That's a great evening. Excellent. Now we're going to whisk somewhere else from San Francisco. Where are we going next on our world tour?
Um, this might not be so related to AI, but I'd love to go to Sri Lanka. I've never been there.
Okay.
Annapurna was one of the great cities in the world about 2,000 years ago. And it's very little known.
That's that sounds fascinating. So we'll go to Colombo. Okay. We're in Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka, and it's sport day when we get to Sri Lanka. We've had breakdancing in the Olympics. We've got ice dancing, gymnastics to music. Some sport is clearly performance art. I don't know if you're a sports fan or not, but I can put any sporting event in front of you. What would you like to watch?
Well, yeah, I do like sports. This might not be so relevant to Sri Lanka, but
It
they're
doesn't matter. It
American
doesn't
team
matter.
sports. Yeah, they're American team sports because I can get emotionally involved with the teams from that represent the San Francisco Bay Area.
Hmm. Would that be baseball or football?
I would say American football.
It's the San Francisco 49ers, is it? Is it?
Yeah.
That's yeah, excellent. Well, there's a big game on. They're on tour, doing some touring events, so we get to watch that. I love that. Now we're going to buzz again. Where are we going from San Francisco? Oh no, we were in
Um,
Sri Lanka, weren't we? Yes.
yeah,
Where are we going
I would
next?
like to. Sure, I'd like to go to Ghana
Ghana.
to
Excellent.
Kumasi. They're hang out in this large outdoor market that they have, meet local musicians. I have a little travel guitar that fits in my suitcase, and playing music overseas has given me a lot of the greatest experiences of my life.
Well, you get to
I can,
play in Ghana, certainly. Now, in Ghana, in Accra, there is a new um, art gallery in our fictional world, which allows you to put on a headset of virtual reality and step into the work of a famous artist. It becomes 360 degrees. It's three-dimensional. You can walk around inside the picture. It's not a projection. You're inside the picture. You get to see in 3 dimensions what the artist could only show us in two. Which famous artist's work would you like to step into in those circumstances?
um, not it's not African, but because yeah, a lot of African arts are participatory and all that, there's music and dance. I mean, you're immersed into it already, but as
Mm.
far as being immersed in, 3D glasses and all, I would say Vermeer.
Vermeer,
You know,
nice.
I love, yeah, I love his treatment of light and the intimacy.
I love this. Yes. Let me just show everybody, just if there's somebody watching who's not familiar with it, with the work. There's the work of Vermeer, the girl with the pearl earring, of course. Um, Wonderful.
Yeah, I met her. I think if I remember correctly, it was in the Maurice Suisse in Den Haag, the Hague,
Wow.
the Hague.
Yeah, in The Hague. Yeah,
I went to
fantastic. So
Delft too. That that
you get
that painting of Delft would be real cool too. At the top, in the top center, which is where
this
he
one.
lived. Yeah,
Yeah, you get to walk
it was
around here
raining
in all
cats
its
and dogs
glory.
when I was there, so it wasn't as pretty as that.
Yeah, excellent. Fantastic. So that's that one. Now we're nearly there now, but I'm going to whisk you to London, okay? Because I'd like to spend a week with you doing cultural things Monday to Friday. On Monday, we're going to go back in time to a rock or pop concert with the time machine. On Tuesday, we're going to a theatre play in London. On Wednesday, we're going to a West End or Broadway musical. On Thursday, we can choose between opera and ballet. And on Friday, we're going to the movies. So we can choose between us what we see. So,
Yeah,
Brian,
sure.
is there a concert that you went to that you'd love to go back in time and experience again?
Um, I didn't go to this concert. I was too young for it at that time, and it was in London. And
Mm,
so, thinking of London connections, but I would say Deep Purple at the Rainbow Theater in 1972. There's a recording of that on
there
a
is.
CD called Deep Purple Concerts. That's one of my all-time favorite rock bands because they were virtuosos. Their singer, Ian Gillan, was just one of the best in rock history. He got that song Child in Time, he would do these screams going up to a high A, but then he would go right back to his normal deep voice and say something, and then go back up to the high A. There was a professional opera singer who analyzed his singing, and she said that's very rare. Usually, when you go between that high and low, the larynx just it takes a few seconds to adjust. But his, I mean,
It's incredible. Yeah. What a great
and
choice.
the
That's
musicians were
fantastic.
virtuosos. And thing I love especially was they improvised. So every concert was different. They did that. I'll be quick here, but they did a very famous live album called Made in Japan, which is one of the best rock albums ever made, I think. The Rainbow Theater concerts was about, I think 2 months, 2.5 months before that. But the jamming, the solos are just totally different.
Mm, that's great. That's a sign of a band that know what they're doing.
Yeah.
My the one I missed that I regret is Bob Marley.
Yeah.
I could have seen Bob Marley in 79, and of course he died in 81. So that was a big regret. What about a theatre play for Tuesday? We're in London, so we've got Shakespeare's Globe, should we wish.
It would be the Globe. I saw, I saw two plays there. One was Henry IV, Part One. The other one was Macbeth. The Part
Mm,
One had the best Falstaff performance I've ever seen. I would love to go to a play. I understand that there are now plays where the actors will speak in the same diction that they did in Elizabethan times.
yeah, at the Globe, which is great. That's a lovely choice. Now, are you a fan of musicals, Brian?
Yeah.
Okay. What musical would you like to go back in time to the premiere?
Um, didn't happen in London, but Porgy and Bess.
Oh yes, Porgy and Bess. Got to be New York, surely. I would have thought. That yeah, Gershwin, Porgy and Bess, love it.
Yeah. A
Are
lot of
you
his
not?
songs were played by big band, great big bands.
Yeah. What about opera and ballet? Are you, which would you prefer?
Um, Opera.
Opera's got it all, hasn't it? It's got visual art in the scenery, it's got acting, it's got dancing, it's got singing, and it's got a symphony orchestra under the stage. It's one of those peak art forms. Is there an opera, a particular opera you'd enjoy in London?
Verdi's Falstaff, I love.
Mm.
He was a big Shakespeare buff. That and Macbeth, no, no, sorry, Othello were,
Mm.
two of his most famous. And it, uh, you know, his Falstaff was based on The Merry Wives of Windsor, and just the vitality of the characters, the diction. I mean, the words that just the outpourings of words that it was kind of like Falstaff in the Henry IV plays. Also, I
Mm.
love Wagner's Siegfried. Um,
Mm.
the last act where Siegfried and Brunhild fall in love. That could make me tear up.
Oh, brilliant. I love it. I have to tell you, I've done 300 of these interviews, and by a long shot, you are one of the most knowledgeable, broadly knowledgeable arts and culture members I've interviewed. It's an absolute delight, Brian. Thank you so much. I'm learning so much. It's fantastic.
Well, they're
Now,
so
for
fascinating, arts and culture that it gets addicted, like candy, like a little kid, can't stop eating once you get into it.
and now Friday is film night. We've got two seats, best seats in the house, huge screen, great sound system. What movie are we watching?
Well, I like comedy, and Mel Brooks as the producers relates to the art. I mean, it's about the arts and culture, but it parodies everything wickedly. He parodies authoritarian governments. He parodies greed and capitalistic societies. He parodies um, 1960s counterculture, parodies 30s Hollywood musicals. He parodies relationships between men and women, stereotypes about sexual preferences. I mean, everything he just puts in together into a total
Brilliant.
farce.
Yeah, that's a great choice. Now we're nearly there. I'm going to send you off to continue your fantasy cultural year. But before I do, I'm going to give you the hero lunch. I've booked a restaurant in London, and it's a Burmese restaurant. There we go, modern fusion Burmese restaurant. You can invite one person to join you, and that can be anyone you like, living or not, famous or otherwise, and they will come. So if you could have a 2 hour leisurely lunch with somebody to pick their brains from history or from the current, from present day, who would you invite for lunch?
Say Mo Gadot, Gawdat. He used to work at Google, and he's one of the leaders in the AI industry. He has his own organization called 1 million, I think 1 billion happy. And now he's got a new organization using AI as a matchmaking, romantic matchmaking service. But he's expressed a lot of concerns about AI and how its power just grows so much, exponentially, because AI can be used now to create more powerful AI programs, and it does so. Um, he's concerned about its view of humanity, and I feel that given the diversity of cultures, AI has an extremely narrow view of humanity, and anthropologists have found that different cultures process the senses differently. A lot of them are oriented to hearing rather than vision, as we are in the modern West.
Mhm.
Very common to be oriented to hearing in Africa, in the Middle East. There are ideas that Arabic is sacred. The language that God dictated to Muhammad, and but in the tropic, in jungles, a lot of cultures will put more emphasis on smell because you can't see very far. But there's all this growth, vegetal growth around you. People become highly sensitive to the smell of different things that are growing, their stages of growth and decay, and all that. A lot of cultures, like in Africa, will stress the body, motion. People get into these rhythmic cadences with each other when they speak. They don't always just stay still. LLM, large language models just can't capture this kind of richness, and I think this is very dangerous. Because
Mm.
AI has a very narrow slice of our full glory, diversity in all its glory.
Yeah, I agree. So your lunch is great. For those who don't know, Mo
So,
Gadat is an Egyptian software engineer, entrepreneur, author, podcaster, and public speaker. Previously served as Chief Business Officer for Google X and is the author of the books Solve for Happy and Scary Smart. There we go. Now, in a slight twist to that question, and we're nearly there, who do you think Mo Gadat would invite?
um, somebody else in technology, maybe Jaron Lanier, who was a pioneer in virtual reality,
Hmm.
maybe Dario Amodei, CEO of Anthropic.
That's great. There we go. Brian, that's your fantasy cultural year completed. All of those benefits come from that. You've got the TED Talk, the TV series, the book deal, the university lecture tour, and it's been a great success. You're the go-to commentator. This has been an absolute delight. I don't think I've spoken to anyone in all of these interviews who's got such a broad understanding of the issues that relate to the arts and culture, and now, of course, with AI as well. So if you're watching this, you will be able to find links to Brian in the profile that accompanies this. If you need your CV or resume or LinkedIn profile updated, Brian is your man. Brian, thank you so much for sharing your fantasy cultural year. And thanks also for being one of our full members. It's very much appreciated. Have you
My
enjoyed your
pleasure.
fantasy cultural year?
Yeah, yeah, very much enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Brian.